The vault's lock clicked open too easily, and as the door swung wide, Elias heard voices that knew his name, though he'd never spoken it here. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a mail coach that hadn't visited Elias Crane's cottage in over a month. The envelope was thick with dust and bore the faded seal of Blackhaven, a mining town that most people had forgotten existed, tucked away in the shadow of the Whispering Mountains. Elias turned the letter over in his weathered hands, noting how the paper felt brittle, as if it had been waiting years to be delivered. Asterisk, Mr. Crane. The letter began in careful script. Your reputation as a master locksmith has reached our remote community. We require your services for a matter of considerable urgency. The old Blackhaven Miners Bank possesses a vault that has remained sealed since the collapse of '73. The current owner of the building wishes to assess its contents before the structure is condemned. Your fee will be substantial and lodging can be arranged. Please respond at your earliest convenience. Asterisk, it was signed by one Magnus Thorne, mayor of Blackhaven. Though Elias had never heard of the man, he set the letter on his kitchen table and stared at it while his morning tea grew cold. The collapse of '73, he remembered reading about it in the papers. A mining accident that had claimed dozens of lives buried beneath tons of rock and earth. The town had never recovered, its population dwindling until it became little more than a ghost settlement clinging to the mountainside. But the fee mentioned in the letter was generous, more than generous. Elias had been struggling through a lean winter, his usual clientele in the valley towns finding less need for his specialized services. The promise of steady work, even for a few days, was too tempting to ignore. He penned a brief reply, accepting the commission, and posted it that same afternoon. The journey to Blackhaven took 2 days by hired carriage, winding through mountain passes that seemed to grow narrower and more treacherous with each mile. The driver, a taciturn man named Hodges, spoke little during the trip, but Elias noticed how his knuckles grew white on the reins as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and colder, carrying with it the scent of old stone and something else, something that reminded Elias of the deep places underground. Blackhaven emerged from the morning mist like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room. The town clung to the mountainside in defiance of gravity and common sense, its buildings constructed from the same gray stone that formed the peaks around it. Many of the structures showed signs of abandonment, boarded windows, sagging roofs, gardens gone wild with mountain weeds. But there was life here still, smoke rising from a handful of chimneys, and the occasional figure moving through the narrow streets. The Blackhaven Miners Bank stood at the heart of the town, an imposing structure of cut stone and iron that had been built to last centuries. Its windows were dark, their glass streaked with decades of rain and neglect, and the heavy wooden doors were bound with chains that looked newer than the building itself. Elias stood before it, his leather toolcase in hand, and felt a strange reluctance to approach. "You must be the locksmith," said a voice behind him. Elias turned to see a man of perhaps 60 years, his hair white as mountain snow, and his eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a mayor's chain of office over a simple wool coat, and his handshake was firm but cold. "Magnus Thorne, thank you for coming so quickly. The building looks secure enough," Elias observed, nodding toward the chained doors. "Are you certain you need my services? The vault is inside, Thorn explained, producing a key from his pocket. These chains are merely to keep the curious away. The real challenge lies within. He unlocked the chains and pushed open the heavy doors, revealing a bank interior that time had forgotten. Dust motes danced in the pale light that filtered through the dirty windows, and the air was thick with the smell of old paper and abandonment. The vault stood at the rear of the bank, a massive circular door of steel and brass that dominated. The wall like a mechanical sun, its surface was covered with intricate engraving scenes of miners at work, pickaxes raised, or carts filled with treasure. But it was the lock mechanism that drew Elias's attention, a complex arrangement of tumblers and gears that spoke of craftsmanship from a bygone era. No one remembers the combination, Thorn said, his voice echoing in the empty space. The bank closed after the collapse, and the records were lost. We've tried everything, hiring specialists, even bringing in a safecracker from the city. Nothing has worked. Elias approached the vault door, running his fingers over the cold metal surface. The lock was a masterpiece of engineering, but he could feel its secrets through his fingertips. Every lock had a personality, a unique voice that spoke to those who knew how to listen. This one whispered of secrets buried deep, of things that had been sealed away for good reason. Who owns the building now? Elias asked as he opened his tool case. The bank was sold to a development company after the collapse, Thorn replied. They want to assess the vault's contents before deciding whether to renovate or demolish. A formality, really. There's probably nothing inside but old ledgers and maybe some forgotten deposits. Elias nodded, though something in the mayor's tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. He selected his tools with care, choosing implements that had been passed down through generations of locksmiths. The lock yielded slowly to his ministrations, its tumblers clicking into place with the patience of something that had waited decades to be opened as he worked. Elias became aware of an odd sensation. The bank felt too quiet, even for an abandoned building. The silence was thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of his tools against metal and the occasional creak of settling wood. But underneath it all, he could swear he heard something, else a faint susurrus that might have been wind through the building's gaps, or might have been something else entirely. The collapse, Elias said, pausing in his work. What exactly happened? Thorn's expression grew distant, and he moved to stare out one of the dirty windows. Mineshaft 7 was the deepest in the operation. The miners had been complaining about strange sounds for weeks stabbing that seemed to come from empty spaces, air currents that shouldn't have existed. The foreman dismissed it as settling rock, but the men were growing nervous. And then the support beams failed all at once. Not gradually, as these things usually happen, but simultaneously. 43 men were trapped below, with no way to reach them. The rescue efforts went on for days, but ... double quotes, Thorn shrugged. The mountain keeps its dead. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. He returned to his work, but the lock seemed to resist his efforts now, as if it had heard the mayor's words and grown reluctant to reveal its secrets. The tumblers that had been clicking into place smoothly now fought against his picks, and the gears ground against each other with an almost petulant sound. Were the miners' families compensated? Elias asked, trying to distract himself from the increasing difficulty of his task. The bank handled the payments, Thorn replied. death benefits, widows' pensions, support for the children, all sealed. In this vault, supposedly, though the records are incomplete, the company claimed the paperwork was lost in the confusion after the collapse. There was something in his voice, a note of bitterness, that made Elias look up from his work. "You don't believe that?" "I believe the bank knew more than it let on," Thorne said quietly. "The collapse was too convenient, too thorough, and the families, they were never properly taken care of. Promises were made, but somehow the money always seemed to disappear into bureaucratic holes." Elias felt the last tumbler click into place, and the vault door gave a deep, resonant groan. The massive wheel that served as a handle turned slowly, its movement accompanied by the sound of long-sealed mechanisms finally coming to life. The door swung open with surprising smoothness, revealing a chamber that had been locked away from the world for nearly 50 years. The vault was larger than Elias had expected, its walls lined with safety deposit boxes and filing cabinets. But it was what lay at the center of the room that made his breath catch. A second door, smaller than the first, but no less imposing, was set into the far wall. This one was different, older, its surface unmarked by the decorative engravings that had adorned the outer door. It looked as if it had been hewn from the mountain itself, and its lock was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. "I wasn't aware there was a second vault," Elias said, but when he turned to look at Thorne, he found the mayor had vanished. The bank was empty, except for dust and shadows, and the silence had grown so thick it seemed to press against his ears like water. Elias called out, but received no answer. He walked to the front of the bank and peered out through the chained doors, but the street beyond was empty. Even the smoke from the chimneys had ceased, leaving Blackhaven looking more like a painting than a living town. The only sound was the mountain wind sighing through the gaps in the buildings, with a voice that almost seemed to carry words. He returned to the vault, drawn by professional curiosity and something else, a compulsion that seemed to emanate from the second door itself. The lock was crude compared to the masterwork on the outer vault, but there was something about it that made his fingers tremble as he selected his tools. It was not a lock designed to keep valuables safe, but rather to keep something contained. The mechanism yielded quickly to his picks, too quickly for comfort. As the tumblers fell into place, Elias felt a gust of stale air rush past him, carrying with it the scent of deep earth and something else, something that reminded him of the way air smells just before a storm. But it was the whispers that made him step back in alarm. Voices, faint but unmistakable, seemed to rise from the depths beyond the door. They spoke names: John McCready, Samuel Thorne, William Garetta, litany of the dead that echoed in the confined space of the vault. Elias slammed the door shut and turned the lock, but the voices continued, seeming to seep through the metal like smoke through a keyhole. He gathered his tools with shaking hands and fled the bank, not stopping until he reached the inn where Thorne had arranged his lodging. But even there, in the safety of his rented room, the whispers followed him. They spoke of darkness and crushing weight, of men who had died, calling out for help that never came. And underneath it all, a growing sense that something had been released. Something that had been waiting 43 years to find its way back to the surface. The wrong lock had been opened, and Elias began to understand that some doors were meant to stay sealed forever. Sleep came fitfully to Elias that night, haunted by dreams of darkness and the sound of shifting stone. He woke before dawn to find his room filled with the same stale air that had rushed from the hidden vault. And when he reached for his tools, he discovered that something fundamental had changed. The metal was warm to the touch, almost feverish, and when he held his lockpicks up to the pale morning light, they seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The innkeeper, a weathered woman named Mrs. Caldwell, served him breakfast in uncomfortable silence. Her eyes never quite met his, and she jumped at every sound: the scrape of his chair against the floor, the clink of his spoon against the porcelain bowl. When Elias asked about Mayor Thorne, she merely shook her head and muttered something about him being occupied with town business. "The bank," Elias said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I finished the job yesterday. The vault is open." Mrs. Caldwell's face went pale, and she dropped the serving spoon she had been holding. "You opened it, all of it." "There was a second door," Elias admitted, "hidden behind the main vault. I thought it was part of the commission." The woman backed away from the table, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or might have been grief. "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered. "That door was sealed for a reason. The miners, they weren't just buried in the collapse. They were trapped, screaming for help that never came. The bank knew. They all knew before Elias could ask what she meant." Mrs. Caldwell fled the dining room, leaving him alone with his cooling breakfast and the growing certainty that he had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple locksmith job. He finished his meal in silence, then gathered his tools and prepared to leave Blackhaven. But as he reached for his leather case, he felt something that made him pause. The tools were moving, not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to a casual observer, but with the subtle shifting of metal that had become warm and somehow alive. His lockpicks rearranged themselves in their felt-lined compartments, and his tension wrenches aligned themselves with military precision. When he lifted the case, it felt heavier than before, as if it contained more than just the tools of his trade. The journey down the mountain should have been peaceful, a gradual descent from the thin air and oppressive silence of Blackhaven to the familiar valleys below. But Elias found himself stopping at every locked gate, every secured door, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. His tools seemed to leap from his hands to the locks, working with a speed and precision that surpassed even his considerable skill at an abandoned farmhouse. His picks opened a padlock that secured a root cellar. The moment the metal clicked free, Elias was assaulted by visions flashes of a miner named Thomas Reed, crushed beneath falling timber, his final moments, filled with the taste of dust and the sound of his own labored breathing. The images were so vivid that Elias staggered, his hands clutching at his head as if he could physically push the memories away. But the visions didn't stop there. At a derelict church, his tools opened a locked strongbox to reveal the final moments of Samuel Thorne, the mayor's son. Elias realized, trapped in a pocket of air that grew smaller with each passing hour. The man's desperate prayers echoed in Elias's mind, a litany of hope that gradually faded into resigned acceptance. With each lock he opened, each glimpse into the miner's final moments, Elias felt something changing inside him. The whispers that had followed him from the bank grew stronger, more insistent, until they seemed to come from inside his own head. They spoke of injustice, of families left destitute while the mine owners counted their profits, of bodies that had never been recovered because the cost of retrieval was deemed too high. By the time he reached his cottage in the valley, Elias was shaking with exhaustion and something approaching terror. He fumbled with his own front door key, desperate to reach the safety of familiar surroundings. But even his own lock seemed to resist his efforts. When it finally clicked open, he stumbled inside and slammed the door behind him, turning the deadbolt with trembling fingers. The cottage felt different, smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer together while he was away. The fire he had banked before leaving for Blackhaven had somehow rekindled itself, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Elias set his tool case on the kitchen table and stared at it, afraid to open it but unable to look away. When he finally lifted the lid, he found his tools had arranged themselves in a pattern he didn't recognize, a complex mandala of metal that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. At the center lay a single lockpick that he had never seen before, its metal black as midnight and warm as blood. The moment his fingers touched it, the whispers exploded. Asterisk, tell our story. Make them remember. Asterisk. Elias jerked his hand back, but the voices didn't fade. They filled his cottage with the sound of 43 men crying out in the darkness, their words overlapping and intertwining until they formed a single desperate chorus. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound came from inside his head, from the very core of his being. The cottage began to shake, a gentle tremor at first that gradually grew stronger. Books fell from their shelves, and the dishes in his cupboard rattled against each other with increasing urgency. But it was the doors that frightened him. Most every door in the cottage, from the front entrance to the cupboard latches, began to open and close of their own accord, as if invisible hands were testing their mechanisms. Elias grabbed a bottle of whiskey from his pantry and drank deeply, hoping the alcohol would dull the voices that had taken up residence in his mind. But the whiskey only seemed to make them clearer, more distinct. He could hear their individual stories. Now John Macready, who had left a wife and 3 children. William Garrett, who had been planning to propose to his sweetheart. David Hale, who had been working overtime to pay for his mother's medicine. Each man had a story, a life that had been cut short by the greed and negligence of others. And now, somehow, their final moments were trapped in Elias's tools, seeking release through the only means available to them. Every lock he opened became a conduit for their memories, a way to share their suffering with the world above. As the night wore on, the activity in the cottage grew more intense. The doors slammed open and shut with increasing violence, and Elias could see shapes moving in the shadow stall, gaunt figures that might have been men, if men could be carved from darkness and desperation. They reached out to him with hands that seemed to drip with the weight of stone, their mouths open in silent screams. "What do you want from me?" Elias shouted, his voice hoarse from the whiskey and the strain of speaking over the endless whispers. The response came not in words, but in images, flashes of the hidden vault of records that had been sealed away to hide the truth about the collapse. The mining company had known the supports were failing, had ignored the warnings of their own engineers to save money. The families of the dead had been promised compensation that never came, their claims buried in bureaucratic red tape, while the company dissolved itself and reformed under a new name. The truth had been locked away in that hidden vault, sealed behind a door that was meant to keep the evidence buried forever. But Elias had opened it, and now the dead were demanding justice, using his tools as a conduit to reveal their story to the world. "I'm just a locksmith," Elias whispered, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were no longer true. He had become something more, something that stood between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The tools had chosen him, just as they had been chosen by the miners' desperate need for justice. The cottage grew quiet as dawn approached, the whispers fading to a gentle murmur that was almost soothing. Elias sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pattern his tools had formed, and began to understand what was being asked of him. The miners couldn't rest until their story was told, until the truth about their deaths was revealed to the world. And he was the only one who could help them. But helping them would mean returning to Blackhaven, confronting whatever forces had conspired to keep the truth buried. It would mean opening more locks, experiencing more of the miners' final moments, carrying their pain and their memories until justice could be served. Elias picked up the midnight black lockpick from the center of the pattern and felt its warmth spread through his fingers. The whispers grew stronger, more insistent, and he knew that there was no going back. The wrong lock had been opened, and now he was part of something larger than himself, something that would not rest until the dead could finally find peace. The tools of his trade had become instruments of justice, and Elias Crane was no longer just a locksmith. He was the keeper of the miners' secrets, the guardian of their final wishes, and the only hope they had for redemptive return journey to Blackhaven felt different this time, as if the mountain itself was aware of Elias's transformation. The hired carriage driver, a different man than before, spoke nervously throughout the trip, commenting on the unusual behavior of his horses and the way the wind seemed to carry voices from the peaks above. Elias sat in silence, his tool case resting on his lap, feeling the weight of 43 souls pressing against his consciousness. The tools had continued their subtle movements throughout the night, arranging themselves in new configurations that seemed to tell a story. The midnight black lockpick had multiplied, or perhaps revealed companions that had been hidden before. Now there were 43 of them, each one warm to the touch and humming with its own distinct frequency. When Elias held them, he could feel the individual personalities of the miners they represented, their hopes, their fears, their final moments of desperate clarity. Blackhaven looked different in the gray morning light, more substantial somehow, as if the town had gained weight during his absence. Smoke rose from chimneys that had been cold before, and figures moved through the streets, with purpose rather than the aimless wandering he had observed during his first visit. As the carriage clattered through the narrow streets, Elias caught glimpses of faces in windows pale, drawn features that watched his passage with expressions of desperate hope. The inn was bustling with activity when he arrived, filled with people he hadn't seen during his previous stay. They were all older, their faces lined with grief and hard living, and they all turned to stare at him as he entered the common room. Mrs. Caldwell stood behind the bar, her eyes red-rimmed, but filled with a determination that hadn't been there before. "You came back," she said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "I didn't think you would." "I had to," Elias replied, setting his tool case on the nearest table. "The miners, they won't rest until their story is told." A murmur ran through the room, and Elias realized that these people were the families of the dead widows, children grown to adulthood, parents who had outlived their sons. They had been waiting for someone to return, someone who could open the doors that had been sealed against them for 43 years. "You can hear them," said an elderly woman who sat near the fireplace. Her hair was white as snow, and her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes burned with the same intensity Elias had seen in the miner's final moments. "My son William used to write letters about the sounds in the mine. He said the mountain was trying to tell them something." "Mrs. Garrett," Mrs. Caldwell said gently, "this is the locksmith who opened the vault." The old woman rose from her chair and approached Elias with the careful steps of someone who had spent decades carrying an unbearable weight. "Can you help them?" she asked. "Can you help my William find peace?" Elias felt the midnight black lockpick pulse in his case, and he knew that William Garrett was among the voices that had taken up residence in his mind. The young man's final thoughts had been of his mother, of the letter he had been writing to her when the supports gave way. He had died clutching a photograph of her face, and his last words had been a whispered apology for not being able to. "Come home, I can try," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need to understand what really happened, the truth about the collapse, about why the vault was sealed." An older man stepped forward, his face bearing the weathered look of someone who had spent his life underground. "Magnus Thorne," he said, and Elias recognized the voice of the mayor who had hired him. "But I'm not the mayor anymore. Haven't been for years. I only took the role to hire you, to bring someone here who could open what needed to be opened." "Your son," Elias said, remembering the vision he had experienced. "Samuel Thorne. He was one of the miners." Magnus nodded, his composure cracking slightly. "My boy was the shift foreman. He knew the supports were failing, tried to warn the company. They told him to keep working, said the deadline was more important than his concerns. Samuel died trying to save his men when the collapse came." The room fell silent, except for the soft sound of weeping. Elias felt the weight of their collective grief, the decades of unanswered questions and unresolved pain. These people had been living with the knowledge that their loved ones had died, not from an accident, but from the willful negligence of those who valued profit over human life. "The evidence is in the vault," Magnus continued. "Company memos, inspection reports, correspondence between the mine owners and the bank. Everything needed to prove that the collapse was preventable. But it was sealed away, buried like the men who died in Shaft 7. Why now?" Elias asked. "Why wait 43 years to try to open it?" "Because we're dying," said Mrs. Garrett simply. "The families are getting older, and the children who never knew their fathers are having children of their own. Soon there will be no one left to remember, no one left to seek justice. This is our last chance to tell the truth." Elias opened his tool case and stared at the pattern of lockpicks, each one representing a life that had been lost to greed and corruption. He could feel their urgency, their desperate need to have their story heard. But he could also sense something else's presence that had been growing stronger since his return to Blackhaven. Something that opposed his mission with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "There are others who don't want the truth to come out," Magnus said, as if reading his thoughts. "The mining company may be gone, but their influence remains. There are people in positions of power who have spent decades keeping this secret buried. They won't let it surface without a fight, as if summoned by his words. The inn's door burst open, and a group of men in expensive suits entered the common room. They moved with the confidence of people accustomed to getting their way, and their leader, tall, thin man with silver hair and cold eyes, surveyed the gathered families with obvious disdain. "Mr. Crane," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "I am Harrison Blackwood, representing the interests of the Blackhaven Development Corporation. I understand you've been retained to open certain secured areas of the old bank building." "The vault is already open," Elias replied, his hand moving instinctively to his tool case. "Ah, but there are deeper vaults," Blackwood said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Areas that were sealed for reasons of public safety. We have a court order preventing any further excavation or lock-picking in the building. Your services are no longer required." Magnus stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You have no authority here. This is our town, our history. This is a matter of law," Blackwood replied smoothly. "The building is scheduled for demolition next week. Any evidence of historical significance will be properly preserved by qualified professionals. These amateur investigations only serve to disturb the peace of the dead." But as he spoke, the inn began to shake, a gentle tremor that gradually grew stronger. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire in the hearth flickered as if blown by an invisible wind. The families looked up with expressions of hope rather than fear, recognizing the presence that had come to their aid. "The dead aren't at peace," Elias said, his voice carrying a new authority. "They won't rest until their story is told, until justice is served. And I'm going to help them." He opened his tool case, and the midnight black lockpicks rose into the air, hovering around him like a crown of metal thorns. The temperature in the room dropped, and everyone could hear the whispers, now three voices speaking in unison, their words overlapping and intertwining until they formed a single, undeniable truth. The mine owners knew, the voices said. They knew the supports were failing. They knew men would die. They chose profit over safety. And then they buried the evidence with our bodies. Blackwood and his men backed toward the door, their confident demeanor cracking in the face of something they couldn't control or intimidate. "This is illegal," Blackwood stammered. "You can't, I can," Elias said, feeling the power of 43 souls flowing through him. "And I will. The truth has been buried long enough." The lockpicks returned to their case, but their warmth remained, pulsing through Elias's hands like a living heartbeat. He looked around the room at the faces of the families, seeing hope in their eyes for the first time in decades. They had waited 43 years for this moment, and they were ready to see it through to the end. "The bank," Magnus said. "There are more vaults, deeper ones, places where the most damaging evidence was hidden. Can you open them?" Elias felt the miners' voices rise in his mind, their whispers now a chorus of determination. They had waited long enough for their story to be told, for their deaths to have meaning. The wrong lock had been opened, and now there was no going back. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 43 souls. "I can open them." All the bank stood in the pale afternoon light, like a monument to buried secrets, its stone walls, holding the weight of decades of silence. Elias approached the building with the families of the dead behind him, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets of Blackhaven. The sound seemed to wake the town from its long slumber, and faces appeared at windows, watching the procession with expressions of solemn anticipation. The front doors stood open, the chains that had secured them lying broken on the ground. Elias hadn't touched them, hadn't even approached the building since his return. But somehow his transformed tools had reached out across the distance to clear the path. The midnight black lockpicks pulsed in his case, eager to complete the work they had begun. Inside, the bank felt different than before. The dust had settled, and the air carried the scent of something long buried coming back to life. The main vault door stood open, revealing the smaller chamber beyond, but it was what lay beneath that drew Elias's attention: the wooden floor. In the center of the vault had been pulled away, revealing a stone staircase that descended into darkness. The lower vaults, Magnus explained, his voice hushed with reverence, built into the mountain itself. The mining company used them to store their most sensitive documents, records they never wanted to see the light of day. Elias felt the weight of 43 souls pressing against his consciousness, their whispers rising to a crescendo of anticipation. They had waited so long for this moment, for someone to descend into the depths and bring their truth back to the surface. The lockpick, in his case, glowed with their own inner light, casting dancing shadows on the vault walls. "I'll go alone," Elias said, but Mrs. Garrett shook her head. "We've waited 43 years, she said firmly. "We're not waiting any longer. Whatever's down there, we face it together." The others murmured their agreement, and Elias realized that these people had been transformed by their grief, just as he had been transformed by his tools. They were no longer just grieving families. They were guardians of memory, keepers of truth, and they would not be turned away from their purpose. The staircase descended deeper into the mountain than Elias had expected, carved from living rock and lit by phosphorescent deposits that seemed to glow in response to their presence. The air grew colder as they descended, and the whispers of the dead grew stronger, until it seemed as if the miners themselves were walking beside them. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a corridor lined with iron doors, each one secured with a lock that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. These were not ordinary locks. They had been forged with the specific purpose of keeping secrets buried, of ensuring that certain truths would never see the light of day. But Elias's tools had been transformed by the desperate need of the dead, and they sang with power as he approached the first door. The lock yielded instantly to his touch, and the door swung open to reveal a chamber filled with filing cabinets and document boxes. The papers inside were perfectly preserved, protected by the mountain's cold embrace, and they told a story of corruption and negligence that took Elias's breath away. Inspection reports dating back years before the collapse, all documenting the same conclusion: the supports in Shaft 7 were inadequate. The safety protocols were being ignored, and disaster was inevitable. Company memos discussing the cost of proper safety measures versus the expense of potential lawsuits. Correspondence between mine officials and bank executives, planning how to hide assets and dissolve the company if the worst should happen. "My God," whispered Magnus, reading over Elias's shoulder. They knew. They all knew. But it was the contents of the second vault that truly shocked them. Personnel files on every miner who had died in the collapse, complete with psychological profiles and family information. The company had been planning for the disaster, identifying which families would be most likely to accept small settlements and which would need to be intimidated into silence. "They treated us like pawns," said Mrs. Garrett, her voice shaking. "With rage. Our sons, our husbands, they were just numbers in their calculations." The third vault contained the most damaging evidence of all recorded conversations between company executives, transcribed by a secretary who had apparently grown disgusted with what she was witnessing. The executives spoke casually about the coming disaster, discussing how to minimize their legal exposure and maximize their profits from the insurance claims. "We need to document everything," Elias said, his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. "Every page, every memo, every piece of evidence. The world needs to know what happened here." But as they worked, Elias became aware of a presence in the depths of the mountain, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been feeding on the buried secrets for decades. The whispers of the dead grew agitated, warning him of danger, and he realized that the mining company's corruption had awakened, something that should have remained asleep. The creature manifested slowly, seeping through the rock walls like smoke, made solid. It was darkness given form, greed made manifest, and it spoke with the voices of all those who had profited from the forgotten vault.